We have been working on since 2014, when we saw these hybrid tactics used against Ukraine. So the use of hybrid tactics, small green men in Crimea and later on in eastern Ukraine, and that triggered the response of NATO, which I just have described. But just to highlight some of the main things we do to respond to this more blurred line, this mixture of military and non-military use of aggression or means of aggression, covert and overt operations, cyber, and all these different tactics which are not a regular conventional attack. You mentioned some of them already. We need better intelligence to understand what's going on. And therefore we have just established now a new intelligence division in NATO. And of course this is very much based on the intelligence that different NATO allies or the different NATO allies collect. But to be better able to understand, to analyze, to share, we have established a new intelligence division in NATO. We are in the process of developing a new system and capability, including with a new surveillance drones, which will be based in several surveillance drones, which will be based in Europe, in Italy, in Sicily. They will give us a much better picture, situational awareness, if there are crises, instability somewhere close to our borders. Higher readiness of our forces is also part of the response to hybrid threats, because since you don't know, since there is zero warning time or very little warning time, the readiness of forces is extremely important. So in that sense, also the deployment of the Canadian-led battle group to Latvia and to the other Baltic countries is part of response to hybrid threats, because we are already there. So yes, it's harder to identify when you're under attack, but when you're able to tell, then we can react extremely quickly by higher readiness. Then the last thing I will say about NATO is extremely supportive of a rules-based international order. That's actually in our founding treaty, a clear reference and link to the UN Charter. And NATO has been upholding the international rules-based order since we were founded 69 years ago today. And we will continue to do so, because we strongly believe that that's the best way to preserve the peace and security of all of us.
Thank you. Now it's time for the audience. Can you please identify yourself if you're going to ask a question? At the same time, please remember that there's going to be a fair number of questions. I see people's hands going up. So a question, not a speech. So, lady at the back, question.
Oh, okay, sure. Hi, my name is Zanera. I'm a graduate student here at Public International Affairs program. And my question is, you mentioned that the world is becoming more unstable and uncertain. Last week, Ottawa actually hosted Steven Pinker, who makes the case about how the world is becoming much more safer. And like, as a civilization, like, we're progressing upward. So how would you respond to his argument and his case about peace? Thanks.
So, I don't know the details of what he said, but I think I agree, because and then I have to explain, because it sounds like I'm contradicting myself. But the long-term trend is that the world becomes a better place to live. For instance, if you measure by life expectancy, that increases almost every year. So people live longer. I think that's a good, what should I say, a measurement of that we succeed with something. Child mortality is going down. Hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. And actually, if you look at, for instance, I know the statistic for Europe, there are fewer people killed in terrorist attacks today than during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because ETA, IRA, and so on actually killed a lot of people. And Rote Armee-Fraktion and these terrorist organizations. And sometimes we tend to forget that. To be honest, I very often refer to those figures because we have to remember that, well, it has been wars before, yeah, and there are fewer people killed in regular military conflicts now than at least if you look back a decade or 2 or 3. Then there are 2, 3 problems, and we have to address them. First, at least during the last 2, 3 years, we have seen an increase in terrorist attacks, at least in some of our member states. Again, you had one attack here in Canada against the parliament, but you have Brussels, Paris, and so on in Europe, Nice and other countries, or other cities. And then you have Daesh, which really posed a real threat to 2 countries which are neighboring NATO. They were close to taking over Baghdad if NATO allies hadn't intervened back in 2014. And you have a more assertive Russia. There's no doubt about that. Russia is much stronger now. They have invested heavily in military equipment, modernizing their armed forces, including their nuclear forces, and they are integrating nuclear forces tactics with their conventional tactics. They're actually blurring a bit the line between conventional and nuclear forces. And then you have the proliferation of nuclear forces, especially with North Korea. On top of that, you have cyber. So yes, I agree that the long trend has been that, first of all, the world is moving in the right direction. Higher life expectancy, less child mortality, economic wealth. And also, roughly, there has been a decrease in people killed in armed conflicts. But there are some really serious worrying signs going in the opposite direction, and we have to respond to them, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Now, this lady in the front.
Oh, yeah, you got it. Oh, yeah. Hello. First of all, thank you so much for being here. My question is regarding lethal autonomous weapon systems.
Can you identify yourself first, please?
Oh,
sorry.
yeah, sorry. My name is Niveen. I'm a student at the University of Ottawa, political science and communication. So my question is regarding the lethal autonomous weapon systems in which the human is out of the loop. What is NATO's position on this new technology, and what role do you see NATO playing in creating international regulatory bodies?
I think that the development of technologies like artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, lethal weapons, is something which just highlights the importance of a rules-based order, respect for international law, and if necessary, augmenting and strengthening the institutions and the rules-based order to make sure that we also can deal with these new weapon systems. NATO is a strong supporter of a rules-based order and fully respecting international law, and that's actually one of the reasons why we exist. And we always have the dilemma in a way that we see new technology. We need to maintain our technological edge, which NATO has always had. That has helped us prevent war, deliver credible deterrence. But at the same time, we should work with other countries to try to establish the institutions we need to avoid those technologies being misused. And we have one very relevant example now, and that's chemical weapons. NATO is strongly against chemical weapons, and chemical weapons are forbidden. And we support, of course, the efforts of the OPCW, the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And that's also one of the reasons why we reacted so strongly when we saw the use of a chemical military nerve agent in Salisbury.
Thank you. Gentleman over there.
Thank you. My name is Francis Yell. One of South Sudanese here, president of South Sudanese in Ottawa. One day when I was in Cairo in one student asking President Mubarak that you might concerning what is going on in Middle East, but you are not might concerning what is going on in Africa. So today I'm asking, my question is, what is exactly the role of NATO in Syria and the war in Yemen? Thank you.
So NATO is the answer to, or at least part of the answer to many problems, but NATO is not the answer to all problems. And meaning that many NATO allies are of course involved in, for instance, trying to solve the conflict in Yemen. NATO is not playing a direct role there as an organization, but we support strongly the efforts of the UN to find a peaceful solution to end the bloodshed and the violence we see in Yemen, but NATO as an organization is not directly involved. To some extent, not in the same way, but to some extent, that's also the case for Syria, meaning that NATO is not present on the ground in Syria. What we do is that we provide support to the counter-ISIL coalition, which has helped to reduce and almost win the battle against. The presence of the coalition in Syria and Iraq has liberated almost all the territory that Daesh controlled in Syria and Iraq. The job is not done, so the coalition is still present. NATO is present in Iraq, where we provide training, but we are not present on the ground in Syria. But again, we support the efforts of finding a political solution to the crisis in Syria, because we don't believe that in the long run there is a military solution. It has to be a negotiated political solution.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front there.
Hi, my name is Andreas Björnbeck. It's nice to have another Kata alumni here. I'm in poli-sci and history. First of all, I want to thank you for the response to 22 juli. You've been a hero to me for a long time. How was going from being the Prime Minister of Norway, a very successful one for one of that, I might add, to being the leader of NATO? I read your piece in Aftenposten the other week, where you mentioned how the West is in kind of a deep peace, and that might be a threat to being able to respond to a conflict. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is a big difference being a prime minister in Norway and being Secretary General of NATO. And of course, with all respect for Norway, we are not the biggest country in the world. So we are not dominating the international scene in all areas, at least. We are big in some areas, for instance, energy and together with Canada in the high north and so on. But yeah. So but then. Yeah, and the Olympics, that's important. So then, but so one big difference is, of course, that of course when you're Prime Minister of Norway, you're focused on Norway, mainly on Norway. There are some international engagements, but your main responsibility is Norway. Secretary General of NATO, you have an international responsibility, almost a global responsibility, at least for NATO, and NATO represents close to 1 billion people. We are involved also outside our own territory, so it involves more than the member states. We have many partners, more than 40 partner countries, so we are close to global, or a global institution, also working with global partners. So it's a much more international approach than being a Prime Minister of Norway. The other big difference is that when you're Prime Minister of Norway or any other country, you have to work with many different issues: health, education, security, defense, environment, transportation, pensions was one of my main favorites when I was Prime Minister. So then there are many different issues. As Secretary General of NATO, I'm focused on one thing, and that is defense, security, international issues. So I don't address all the other issues. And that's a big difference. Having said all that, there are also many similarities. Because when you are a prime minister in Norway and also in many other countries, you need, and especially since I was prime minister in a coalition government, you need to find compromises and to make people find solutions together. And that's very much the same. That's not a big difference. So the way you work with people, the way you try to find balanced compromises is very parallel from Norwegian politics to Secretary General of NATO.
So we have roughly time for 2 more questions. So I'll ask both of them to ask the questions now, and perhaps we can finish off the question period with that. So hands now, gentleman at the back, and then the gentleman in the front over there.
Thank you. Hi, my name is George. I'm a master's student here at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. My question is, recently we've seen a massive spike in tension between 2 NATO partners, Greece and Turkey. So my question is, how does NATO go about handling this situation where we might see an actual conflict occur within the Aegean Sea? And how does NATO go about diffusing this potential situation?
Both Turkey and Greece are 2 highly valued NATO allies, and they play an important role, not least in addressing the migrant and refugee crisis, where we have a NATO deployment of NATO ships in the Aegean, helping to implement the agreement between Turkey and EU on the migration crisis in Europe. And then NATO provides some ships. Canada has been part of that, actually, and NATO also provides a platform for enhanced or strengthening cooperation between a non-EU member but NATO member, Turkey, and the European Union and Greece. There are some sort of historical differences, but that's for Greece and Turkey to address. It's not an issue that it's for NATO to solve. We provide a framework for bringing nations together, and I welcome the fact that sometimes also Greece and Turkey address their differences on the margins of NATO meetings, but it's not for NATO as an organization to solve those problems. That's a bilateral issue they have to address themselves.